Shall we start? Or do you want to wait some more?
Yes, Shri, please.
Yeah.
Ma'am, just wait. Yeah.
Okay. Am I audible?
Yes.
Okay. The diversity may be the hardest thing for a society to live with, and perhaps the most dangerous thing for a society to be without. Good afternoon to all. At the very outset, warm greetings of the day. I, Ashri Dubey, an assistant professor at Vishisht School of Management, welcome one and all present here. It is my pleasure and privilege to welcome our expert for today's session, Dr. Nandini C. Sen, Associate Professor at University of Delhi. I would also like to welcome Dr. Bamendra Naveen Narang, Managing Director, Vishisht School of Management, Dr. S.M. Anas Iqbal, Director, Vishisht School of Management, and all the dear participants to our 6th online guest lecture on cultural diversity, the Indian context. The rapid expansion of social media and telecommunication has given us opportunity to look around and explore the sheer amount of diversity present in our country. I think we are fortunate, the most fortunate citizens because we live in the geographical and emotional unit called India, which has a plethora of languages, culture, religion, caste, creed, beliefs, culinary habits, dressing habits, god and goddesses. Very diverse religions are there, and which are truly unmatched. The diversity, the beauty of any country lies in the people's, the diverse behavior. So yeah, the uniqueness of Indian civilization, despite being very diverse, lies in the ages and old test verified diatom of unity in diversity. So today, yes, I'm really very excited to get more insight into this topic, and I sincerely hope that we'll be able to add some meaning and value to our existing knowledge after today's session. Now, moving ahead with our program, let me take this opportunity to introduce our esteemed speaker of the day, Dr. Nandini C. Sen. She's presently working as Associate Professor at University of Delhi. Prior to this, she was doctoral fellow at Indian Institute of Advanced Studies, Shimla, and also served at the Cluster Innovation Center at the University of Delhi. She has been the Asia representative in the African Literature Conference in 2009 and 2003 respectively. She has recipient of many awards and accolades. To name a few, she has been the recipient of Charles Wallace Fellowship to London in 2001 and 2009. Dr. Sen is recipient of Vishisht Siksha Samman conferred by Vishisht School of Management in the year 2015. She was awarded as ambassador for the Peace Prize by United Peace Federation. Her recent publications include Mahasweta Devi Critical Perspective 2012 and Africa and India in 21st Century Context, Comparison and Cooperation 2015. She has also co-edited the journals The Oriental Anthropologist 2015 and Alternation in 2016 in collaboration with the University of KwaZulu-Natal, South Africa. Her areas of specialization include African studies, post-colonial literature, and gender studies. Ma'am, we are truly honored to have you with us. And yes, once again, I would like to welcome Dr. Nandini Sen, Dr. S.M. Anas Iqbal, Dr. Bamendra Naveen Narang, and all the dear participants. Now, with the blessings of Ma Saraswati, taking our program further, I would request Dr. S.M. Anas Iqbal, Director of Vishisht School of Management, to please present the welcome address. So please.
Thank you, Ashri. First of all, a very good afternoon to everyone. I, on the behalf of entire Vishisht family, welcome you all at this sixth online guest lecture series of the Vishisht Talk. I warmly welcome Dr. Nandini C. Sen, renowned academician of University of Delhi and a renowned panelist of so many national TV channels on the topic of socio-economic issues. And by nature, she is so humble because Once I saw news on the Z News and the NDTV and ABP News that she managed to deposit the financially poor student who got, they were newly admitted student of Delhi University, and her father passed away, and this her mother was a vegetable seller. So she defined is the humble nature of Dr. Sen. I also welcome Dr. Bamne Naveen Narang, is the Honorable Managing Director of VC School of Management. And as concerned to the topic that is cultural diversity in Indian context, culture itself defined as the people's way of life. And Indian land is uh, always known as the cultural diversity because in India is the most religiously and ethnically diverse nation in the world. Indian culture is a blend of various culture, belongs to their religion, caste, regions, their own traditions, set of habits for a group of persons. It is always defined as the land of unity in diversity. So I hope everybody will enjoy, and Madam will give the insight presentation on this very important topic that is cultural diversity in India. Thank you once again, everyone, to join for this sessions. And once again, welcome you all the participants, and this honorable speaker of this sessions, Dr. Sen. Over to Yashri.
Thank you so much, sir, for all your valuable words. Now, not taking much of your time, I would like to request Dr. Nandini C. Sen to please share her valuable words and experience with all of us. Ma'am, please.
Thank you so much, Dr. Iqbal, Yashasri, all the eminent people present here, young students. It's an absolute pleasure to be amongst you all. I had no idea that Dr. Iqbal had seen all of this that he was talking about. That's the very least that one could do. So I'm happy that he appreciated it and that he shared this incident with all of you. That's a very little gesture that I think all of us will extend to our fellow human beings who are not as privileged as we are. So today's topic, I chose with some degree of consternation, with some degree of worry, because I know you all are not literature students, and that's my specialty. I teach English literature. So I was wondering, what is it that I should be wanting to convey to you all, which would interest you and which would make you think? So I thought, let me talk about culture. Now, most people, most of you, and fairly, justifiably so, we all like to think that we understand culture. There's I think in each and every household, there is one sentence which is used very loosely and very comfortably. हमारे कल्चर में ऐसा नहीं होता, तुम ऐसा नहीं करोगी, हमारे कल्चर में नहीं होता. इसका एक जेंडर एस्पेक्ट भी होता है, तुम ऐसा नहीं करोगी, हमारे कल्चर में नहीं होता. And I have always wanted to ask these people that, like, excuse me, what culture studies have you, have you been reading, acquainted yourself with, to come up with this wonderful definition of culture? Obviously, one has not asked that question. So I thought, let me try and take you through some understanding of what culture means. Of course, you have your own understanding, which is justifiable. We have all gotten used to this word, which it is bandied very comfortably. So what exactly is culture? So my lecture is going to be in three parts. I will first take you through some definitions of culture. I want you to understand it as a discipline. And I'll take you through, then we'll discuss some philosophers, some social scientists and what they have to say. The second part, I will talk about India, and then I will talk about the dominant religion of India. I'm afraid, from what both Yashasri and Dr. Iqbal said, it is so vast. This topic that I have, I think we could write books on it. It's incredibly vast. So to try and concise it and to make you think about these issues. So what I'm going to basically be doing is introduce culture to you, introduce culture studies to you, and then take you via India into asking a lot of fairly difficult and uncomfortable questions. So kindly allow me to share my screen. I want to share my screen with all of you.
Just a moment, sir. Hello.
Okay. Just give me a second. Can you see my screen now?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. So I can't see you all anymore. I've made this full screen, but you guys can see me and see the screen, I hope. So I've put my email here. Any of you wanting to connect with me, any of you wanting to share your ideas with me, I'll be more than happy to talk to you. Like I said, this is an ongoing conversation. It doesn't stop with one lecture. So I call it very loosely cultural diversity, the Indian context, but we're going to do a little more than this. So the question that I was going to ask you, what is culture? Now it's a difficult answer. I'll give you a textbook kind of an answer. It derives, you have to know where the word comes from. It comes from a French term, which in turn derives from the Latin word colere, which means to tend to the earth and grow, or cultivation and nurture. Now I want you to pay great attention to words like grow, cultivation, nurture. I think all of you understand what, these are agricultural terms somewhat. To grow something, to nurture something, to protect something, to cultivate something. So, right in my first slide, in my first very basic definition of culture, I hope you've understood that culture is not static. It's not something that stays forever. It's moving, it's changing, it is taking on nuances, it is developing. And yes, we need to grow all the time. The operative word here is grow, not stop in our tracks and say, we have the best culture in the world, we are the best. Then, of course, we're making utter fools of ourselves, which oughtn't to be the case. Some more definitions I want to share. So it's an umbrella term which encompasses the social behavior and norms which are found in human societies, such as knowledge, beliefs, arts, laws, customs, capabilities. I will not explain. These are very simple explanations. And humans acquire culture through the learning process of enculturation and socialization. So when a baby is born, it comes into a family, it learns through the socialization, it meets with people, the kind of food that they're eating, the kind of dress that they wear, and enculturation, learning from each culture learns from each other. So there is this, the basic internal culture that you have inherited through birth. And as you grow and as you take it forward and as you learn from other cultures, the enculturation takes place. Some of the social scientists, it's very important that we know them because, it is, and I'm just talking about one aspect of Durkheim. I want you to read him more. I want you to understand him further. I'm at this point of time, like I told you, I can only touch certain areas, and I'm hoping against hope that these will remain with you and you will take the study forward. And I'm always there to discuss it further with you. So what is Durkheim saying? And look at Durkheim's dates. So he says, he divides it. So logical, functional, and historical. So logical is the power of individuals, belongs to certain culture categories and beliefs such as God. So this is a power that the state or the larger community has over individuals, where culture categories are used to control. And one of the control areas is God. Functional, certain rites and myths create and build up the social order by having more people creating strong belief systems. So there are certain rites and there are certain myths that do the round. So if you do this, this will happen. If you do this, that is going to happen. And certain rites. Okay, there is a puja part, there is a mantrocharan, there is something. These are all supposed to be done for a certain thing. And every time we do this, every time we build on it, and every time we give emphasis to it, it gets further and further entrenched in the society. The third, of course, is historical. So culture has had its origins in the society. And from those experiences come evolution into things such as classification systems. So there is the past and what the past is bringing for us, how the past is taking us forward. So these are the basic divisions that Durkheim does. Of course, Durkheim is a great scholar. He's written so much on the area. Like I said, I want you to go ahead and read it. And every time I want to emphasize that the loose way that we use the word culture is proved wrong every time that we engage with it and try to understand it. Now, another social scientist and very well known, and I'm sure all of you know him, as a major contributor to the conflict theory, Marx has argued that culture serves to justify inequality. The ruling class or the bourgeoisie produces a culture that promotes their interests while repressing the interests of the proletariat. And of course, his most famous line, which we keep quoting, is religion is the opium of the people. So it is very easy to create, and globally we have seen this, it is very easy to keep people subjugated. It is easy for the bourgeoisie to take advantage of the proletariat. I hope you understand terms like bourgeoisie and proletariat. So people with money, people with lands, and people who are poor. It is very easy to keep them in their places. So across the world, we see this one phenomenon where the rich is growing richer and the poor are growing poorer. The way that we can keep the poor in their place, one of the ways is religion. And Marx very correctly tells us that religion is the opium of the people. So it is just, it kind of addles your mind. It makes you want, people can be made to do things which are against their natural instincts, giving them religion as a trope for that. So that's what Marx is telling us. The next person we deal with is another culture theorist, again, very important, and I want you to again explore him and learn about him. That's Max Weber. So what is Weber telling us? Weber tells us that status groups are based on things such as race, ethnicity, religion, region, occupation, gender, sexual preference. These groups live a certain lifestyle based on different values and norms. They are a culture within a culture, and hence Weber comes up with the term of the subculture. So we have a culture within a culture. So this is what we do in the society, but this is what we do in our homes. And this is what I do personally, which I will pass to my daughter or my son, which they will do. So a large subset and a small subset, and then so the subcultures within a culture. Okay. Okay, another thing, at any point, if you are not able to understand, you can keep putting it in the chat box. I will keep checking once in a while. Okay, so what are the elements of culture? Now, this is something which you understand. One of them, of course, are symbols. Anything that carries particular meaning, which is recognized by people who share the same culture. So some symbols we don't need to explain. Some you all are very used to. You see a woman wearing sindoor, or you see a woman wearing chudas, you know that she's married. Nobody needs to come and tell us that this is the case. But let us say this girl wearing chudas were to go to a foreign country. They might just look at it as a way that she's dressed. So, the symbols have different connotations for people of a different place. So we will immediately recognize it as somebody who is newly married. Whereas let us say she's in another part of the world. They might just think, okay, she's wearing a lot of bangles, which are there to make her look very beautiful. Language. It's a system of symbols that allows people to communicate with each other. Now, language, remember, is a great binder, and language gives rise to culture. So we've had language wars. We've had which language precedes which language, which are the languages which are to be given importance. And so language is a very, very important part of our existence, which we again take pretty much for granted. But huge studies have happened in this area and are continuing to happen, because language is a very, very potent thing which binds us and which creates schisms for both the things. Then the value system. So culturally defined standards of desirability, goodness, beauty, and many other things that serve as broad guidelines for social living. So we'll understand that, certain value systems, which I think all of us understand, that to be a good girl, these are the things that you need to be. To be a good husband, these are certain qualifications. To be a good father, certain qualifications. And pretty much the societies agreed upon how or what they should be. Then, of course, the belief systems that if you do this, this will happen. And specific statements that people hold to be true. That if this is done, then this is the natural outcome of it. Therefore, we shall do it or we shall not do it. However, it works out at that point of time. Similarly, norms, rules and expectations by which a society guides and behaves, and of course, behavioral patterns, the typical manner in which people perform production, manual, manufactured, automated in various degrees, communication, language, content, technology choices, and so on. Similarly, how do you sort of satisfy your basic needs for feeding, security, sex, reproduction, entertainment, and such like. So these behavioral patterns also fall into what we broadly term as our cultural spaces, that these are things which form our cultures. Again, artifacts, distinct material objects, architectural brilliances, technologies, social institutions. So the patterns in which the organizations and relationships regarding governance, production, socializing, education, etc. happens. So all of this are linked, and this is how your culture formation eventually is happening at all given points of time. Then there are some cultural tropes which you just learn, which is very simple. You learn through copying. So that's called the learned behavior. So learning through observation and copying, which is combing hair, eating, cooking. Sometimes the behavior is overt, which is obvious behavioral patterns like eating, running, performing daily chores, that you can see that these are the overt behavioral patterns. And then you have covert learning, which is planning revenge, preparing for work, things which you are planning in the head, which we cannot see. So all of this forms your behavioral patterns. Okay, now let me go into what you see the way I write culture. I don't write culture. I deliberately put those inverted commas there because what? I'm sorry, I can hear some music. Okay. So what we understand or we don't understand as the Indian culture. Now, what I argue is that, and what both of you were saying before me, that it is A, extremely vast, B, very complex, C, it is peculiar to each person. So it is very, very wrong when we, try and put it under one umbrella, one rubric and say, this is Indian culture for you. These are the value systems. This is what you should be behaving like. Because each and everything, our religious books, our behavioral patterns, they are all so very contradictory, as I will show you slowly. So the culture of India refers collectively to thousands of distinct and unique cultures of all religions and communities who are present within India. And this is something that we understand. India's languages, religions, dance, music, architecture, food, and customs differs from place to place within the country and is often labeled as an amalgamation of several cultures spanning across the Indian subcontinent. So as Indians, I think it becomes doubly, triply difficult for us to say, okay, this is my culture, because it is so vast, so different, and so peculiar to each people. So what might be the right food for you might not be the right food for another person. So do we have the right to say that, okay, this is the better way to be? Maybe I'm a vegetarian and I think everybody should be a vegetarian, but our laws and our religion allows for non-vegetarianism. So do I then have the right to say vegetarianism is the best and everybody needs to be a vegetarian? These kind of things are what is very contradictory. And why am I discussing this with you? Because today, particularly all of you young people out there is so much information on the internet, so much information that is doled out to you constantly by people who claim to know the Indian culture. Now, as young people, you need to stand up and ask these questions that, excuse me, we do not have one umbrella or one uniform culture, because that's not how our society started. And that's not how our society is at any point of time. So we do not have at any point of time what we can call the composite Indian culture. Because like I mentioned in my very first slide, culture, kindly mute yourself. So what we understand very clearly is that culture is evolving, culture is changing at every given point of time. And at no point of time can anyone claim to be the sole dictator of what the correct culture is supposed to be. Religion and philosophy, since it is religion that we sort of, you know, that forms our cultural understanding in a huge way. So I'm going to be discussing the religion philosophy a bit. So we are indeed a blessed land, which is the birthplace of so many religions. It's incredible. We have Hinduism, Buddhism, Jainism, Sikhism, and other religions. Indian religions are a major form of world religions, along with the Abrahamic religions. So many religions have grown in India. Some have lived and prospered, some have died out. But if we were to be truly liberal, and if we were to be truly, if we were to understand that the plurality of India is what makes India great. It is not by having a unified understanding of India that narrows us down. The more plural we are, the more accommodating we are, the more accepting we are of other religions and of other cultures, the richer we become. And that's true of global cultures. You know, the reason why some societies have progressed more than others is because they're very open to all kinds of cultures coming, and it becomes an amalgamation. The minute we become close, and the minute we start saying that this is what is right, is when we are going to be having a lot of problem, which we are getting to see slowly, because, you know, the narrow version of what is understood as our cultures seem to be suddenly very prominent. And it is time that we start calling it out, particularly all of us academics. So Hinduism and Buddhism are the world's third and the fourth largest religions, respectively, with over 2 billion followers altogether, and as many as 2.5 or 2.6 billion followers. And followers of other Indian religions, Hindus, Sikhs, Jains, and Buddhists, make up for about 80 to 82% of India. There's a little oldish census, 2011, where we have a breakup. So 79.8% of the population practice Hinduism, Islam is 14.2%, Christianity 2.3%, and Sikhism 1.7%, Buddhism 0.7%, Jainism 0.4%, are the other major religions followed by the people of India. Jainism, Zoroastrianism, Judaism, and the Baha'i faith are also influential, but their numbers are smaller. So atheism and agnosticism. Now, this is something that I really want you to pay attention to and understand. That, you know, ours, I think, is one country which has given voice to all kinds of things. And particularly now, let me talk about Hinduism, if there is a word called Hinduism, because it's not the kind of religion that you see. It's got so many books, and each book contradicting the other book. So it becomes very, very interesting. And we have atheism and agnosticism have a long history in India, and which flourished with the Shramana movement and the Charvaka school. It's spelled as Karvaka with a A on top, with a akso on top. The pronunciation is Charvaka. So the Charvaka school originated in India around the 6th century BC. So look at the time frame. So I'm going to take you a little into history so that you get to then question that if in 6th century BC, we could have an atheist being called a rishi. And what does this atheist rishi do? He calls the believers and he has debates with them. Nobody takes out their swords to fight. They're rishis, mind you. They're very educated people. They talk to each other, they discourse. And my favorite term, which I keep using all the time, is as they discourse, they agree to disagree. So you can have your methods, the other person can have their methods, but at no point of time do you have the right to say that my method is the best. So you have the Charvaka school, which originated in India around the 6th century BCE. It's one of the earliest form of materialistic and atheist movement in ancient India. Shramana, Buddhism, Jainism, Ajivika are some of the schools of Hinduism which consider atheism to be valid and reject the concept of the creator, deity, and ritualism superstitious. So this is very interesting. You have somebody who, this is your Rishi Charvaka. So Charvaka does not believe in any kind of superstitions. Charvaka says, I will believe in God if I can see God. He believes in eat, drink, and be merry. He's the first materialistic person that we have had in the Rishi tradition. So one can completely say that, you know, what Charvaka is saying is not acceptable to me. Yes, that is a valid argument. But the rishis of his time, they argued it with him, and each said that, okay, you go your way, I go my way, because he also questioned the Vedas. And the Vedic experts argued with Rishi Charvak. And then they said we part ways, but that does not mean that Charvak ceases to be a rishi. He continues in the rishi tradition, and people understand and study Charvak to understand what is this concept of atheism. What is this concept of materialism that he was talking about that early in time? And why was he saying that? How is it valid? Okay, so we can, one of the, so Charvak is supposed to be the disciple of Brihaspati, and he's usually referred to as the founder of Charvak or Lokayata philosophy. So what is the Lokayata philosophy? Lokayata philosophy simply means, and I'm really simplifying here, you really need to read up to know more about all of these things. So basically it is for the lok, it is for the common person. And this is a philosophy for the common person, because Charvak believed that, you know, this ritualistic understanding of religion effectively ties you down and effectively makes one person superior and one person inferior. See, you will understand it if I make it very simple for you. In a marriage that is happening. Now, two people can go and get married. It is a union of two people. But we do not make it like that. We call a priest. Now, the priest comes and says some mantra. I don't know about you. I don't understand a word, because he says it in a language which mostly nobody understands. But why do we call a priest? Because the priest is supposed to be the link between the common person and God. And it's true of all religions, you will see. So we all have these priests in different religions who will come and interpret the word of God for you. Now, in the Lokayat philosophy, they say, we see what we believe. So why do we need an interpreter? The human being can have a direct relationship with whatever or whoever. You know, we don't need an interpreter to come and act as the mediator between the God and the human. So these were things as early as 6th century BCE, Charvak was raising these questions. And you see how contemporary those questions are, because the answers to those questions are still not there. And most people will say, Toba, Toba, Bhagwan maaf kar do, what kind of thought process is this? But it needs to be discussed and understood, because I think somewhere I do agree with Marx when he says that, you know, religion acts as an opium. It sort of, you know, it takes away certain rationality from us, and we get caught in religious practices. I know I'm literally throwing a stone in the hornet's nest, and many of you might have a problem with this, and I'm happy to discuss it. And like I say, it's always a policy of let us agree to disagree, rather than saying what I think is the best. And that's something that we really need to understand. So another thing that we learn from the Charvak or the Lokayat philosophy is the power of debate. See, all these people were saying, let us debate. Nobody said my philosophy is the best. And the way to sort out who was making more sense was to have a debate. They would sit down, and there would be these great debates which would be organized, which would be watched by people, and the winner of the debate would have proved his point. So all along in our culture, we understand debating. And this is something that you need to, even today, remember. When there is so much of information which is being thrown at you, when you are being asked, are you a supporter of this person or not a supporter? And the supporter and not supporter will have a fight. What we need to do instead of fighting, we need to debate. Debate the ideas, debate the philosophy, debate the economic system as it is happening, the power of debate. What your teacher tells you or what somebody tells you because that person is older need not always be God's own truth. It should be your mind and your power of debating, understanding, which I think is the best way for young people like you all to move forward. Again, like I say, I'm open to debate. Okay, so the next slide.
Hello.
So what was Charvak talking about? Primarily hedonism, which was not accepted by anybody. Next, Epicureanism, hedonistic ideas where you don't believe in God. Epicureanism, eat, live, and make merry. You know, there was even an airlines which went by the name of Epicurean Airlines, which was supposed to be a very, very luxury airlines. I'm talking about contemporary terms. Questioning the Vedas, questioning the existence of God. Materialism, that this is what he believed. Matter is the only philosophy. So what you are seeing is what you believe. Don't believe something which you're not seeing. And then Charvak was also known. You know, we don't know whether there was one person called Charvak or his entire sect, they were called Charvaks. Basically, Charvak is somebody who speaks very nicely. He's a smooth talker. So he's a seller of words. So this is another thing that you have to understand, that somebody who's a glib talker, somebody who's a smooth talker might and has the capacity to take you on a path which might be completely an antithesis of what you truly believe and what you understand. But a smooth talker can make you, start believing in that. And that was Charvak for you. I'm moving from Charvak now to the Ajivikas. So this was yet another group of people. Now the Ajivikas, they are one of the, what we call the Nastic or the heterodox school of Indian philosophy. And it was founded in the 5th century BC. So from 6th century, now we have moved to the 5th century by a person called Makhali Goshala. It was a Shramana movement and a major rival of the Vedic religion. So again, a questioning of Nastic as a word, I think all of you understand. Astic is a believer, Nastic is a non-believer or a disbeliever. So again, this comes as part of a philosophy which is questioning. It is known for its faith in niyati or fate. So here, what the Ajivika school does is they say that we don't believe in free will. You know, all along, through the history of humanity, we always have this question, and this is a very, very big question. Hold it for my further discussion with you all. The determination between what is niyati or fate and what is your free will. So what is a human being supposed to do? Is the human being supposed to have niyati, is just supposed to believe in niyati and accept her or his fate as the final decider of the person's life? Or should there be an exertion of what we understand as free will? So should there be free will or should there be a complete surrender to one's fate? And the Ajivika school did not believe in free will. They believed in turn in niyati. So whatever is the fate. And they believed that everything that has happened and is happening will happen is entirely preordained and a function of the cosmic principles. So this is something that you'll understand. You know, when a child is born and the child starts growing up, one of the terms that is used very, very colloquially, very easily by many people, जो उसके भाग्य में लिखा है, वही होगा. We have all heard it. And we also have stories that when the child is born, niyati or fate comes and she writes on the child's forehead. And that's what the child will eventually become. So then, should people have free will? Or should we sit and wait for niyati to take its own function and take its own route? Is a very difficult question. This is not just a question which is being asked in the Indian philosophy. This is a question which is a global question, which has been, Shakespeare has been talking about it, and it's a perennial question, which is true for everybody. So fate versus free will. And what is our stand on fate versus free will is something that we need to understand. Now I want you to focus on this picture. It's very interesting. You have the Buddha lying there, and the Ajivikas are here. The Ajivika, this part. So Buddha's greatest disciple is having a conversation with the Ajivika priest. So the Ajivika is talking to Buddha's disciple, and what are they doing? They're not killing each other. They are having a perfect, decent conversation where both men are trying to learn from each other and convince one another, and both of them are connected with the Buddha. So you have the Ajivika depicted as one of the famous disciples of the Buddhas, but somebody who had the guts to question his Lord and Master. So yes, I will accept some bit of yours, but I will not accept this because my mind does not allow me to accept. Why am I telling you the stories of Charvaka and Ajivika? The reason why I'm telling you this story is to show you that very early in our civilization, we had the concept of debate. And debate is extremely important to continue with what we understand as our culture. The day we stop debating and start attacking each other, and by debate, for heaven's sake, people, I don't mean the television debates that you see, where each person is wanting to kill the other person. No, that is not debating. When you debate with your facts, and you debate with great politeness, and you debate giving a great deal of respect to your opponent. That is debating. Not when you want to eat the other opponent, or very recently we even had a very senior person mouthing obscenities on TV. No, that is very definitely not debating. So debate is peaceful, it is powerful, it's got the power of words and ideas and thoughts. So over and over again, by showing you these examples, I'm trying to make you, young people particularly, to understand that to move ahead in your life, you cannot be cloistered into thinking that my culture is best or where I come from is best. India is the best. Yes, we are very proud to be Indians, but we have so much to learn. At no point of time can we limit our learning power. And how do we learn? By showing a great deal of respect to the other person, by keeping the power of the debate open for all times. Okay. Now, Goshala's Ajivika sect gained enormous popularity during the Mauryan reign in modern Uttar Pradesh and Bihar. The Maurya king Ashoka dedicated the Barabar caves, which many of you might have visited, to Juna caves to this sect. And after the Mauryan age, the Ajivika sect lost its popularity and became almost extinct by the 11th century. Another character, since we, this is again a very favorite, epic that we all love and read and we understand. So I'm sure all of you are familiar with the Ramayana. For those of you who might not know, I'm sure everyone does, but I'll still tell you. So we have 4 epics in the world. 2 belong to us, in sense, were written here. So the Ramayana and the Mahabharata, and you have the Iliad and the Odyssey in Greece. So these are the 4 epics, out of which the Ramayana and the Mahabharata are, and particularly the Ramayana, they're living epics because they are constantly being performed. So even today we have Ram Leelas and we have performances. Now, the other thing that we also note about the Ramayana, so it's a living epic, and there are many, many kinds of Ramayana. So the Ramayana that you might have, many of you probably know your Ramayana through this TV serial. You obviously understand that it's a dramatization, and it's Valmiki Ramayana with a lot of dramatization. In fact, it's more Tulsi Ramayana than Valmiki Ramayana. And let me stick my neck out a bit more by talking to you about the Valmiki Ramayana. So in the Valmiki Ramayana, Ram is just another character. He plays a role like everyone else. He becomes God only when Tulsidas elevates him to a certain kind of godly figure. So Ram, as we know, through the Valmiki Ramayana is somebody who's accessible, somebody who's, he's a prince, and you have the adventures of this particular prince. And of course, the greatest debates between what is myth and what is reality. I will not get into that debate right now because it's again a never-ending debate. But let me tell you, within the Ramayana, now we are told that Ram is this, the Ramayana that you all are familiar with, the Tulsi Ramayana, and the Ramayana that we normally see in particularly in the north of India, the depictions that we see. Well, there was a person called Jabali in the Ramayana who questioned Ram. And this happened during the Ayodhya Kand, as it's called, or the Ayodhya Kand, when Bharat goes to the forest to convince Ram to return home. He was accompanied by a sophist called Jabali. Now, Jabali uses nihilism. Now, nihilism as a philosophy, we attribute to a much, much later philosopher called Nietzsche. I will not get into all of that. But Jabali uses nihilism, nihilistic reasoning to convince Ram. And he also says that rituals are a waste of food and scriptures were written by smart men so that people will give them alms. So what is Jabali arguing with Ram? He's basically gone with Bharat. Bharat says, I will not be able to convince my brother to come back because my brother believes that what the father has decreed has to be followed. So I cannot bring my brother back. Bharat knows his brother. Bharat knows that Ram will not come back. So he takes Jabali along with him. And Jabali goes there and he argues with Ram. And he tells Ram that, what is the big point? Why? Your father gave word to somebody that now the father is no more, he's dead. You come back, your kingdom needs you. The living people, because Ayodhya is in despair, Ayodhya does not have a ruler, Ayodhya is crumbling. The living people need you, not a dead person's words. So come back. He takes it to a step further and he says, all these rituals that we do for the dead, we waste food and we give food to, we throw away food in the name of the dead and so on. That's a wrong practice when the poor people are going without food. So ideally, let us feed everybody. Now, I'm not in a position to say what Jabali was saying was correct or incorrect. That is for you all to decide. But the point that I'm trying to make is that Jabali can go to a king, a person like Jabali goes to the king and argues completely contrary to what the king was talking about. Now, one would think that the king would say, cut his head off, how dare he? But Ram sits down with Jabali, Ram discourses with Jabali, Ram has a conversation with Jabali, and Jabali is Rishi Jabali. Again, his position as that of one of the priests, one of the advisors of Ram's father is not taken away from him. The point that I'm constantly trying to make is that no one culture holds, and the power of debate. That I'm constantly giving you these examples to make you understand that no one thing holds. Be open to debating. But again, when you debate, the debate has to be with learning first. You have to have your facts and your figures and your understanding. And number two, you have to show a great deal of respect and deference to the person with whom you are debating. It also shows us something which is so fantastic about our religion. Normally we always hear that in our religion, this is what is said. In our religion, because none of us pick up the old books to read them and to try and understand them. So it is very easy for the person who's interpreting the religion to tell us that, oh, God said this, or the prophet said this, or Ramchandra said this, or Jesus said this, or so-and-so said this. Believe you me, all these people were at every given point of time open to debating. And that's what makes the religion hold. So it's not at any point of time, it's not a given. It allows for a great deal of debating, discoursing, atheism, not agreeing. And look at what Jabali did. He went to the king and he argued against the king. He told the king that you are doing something which is wrong. But the king did not get angry. The king heard him out. The king did not agree with him, but the king gave him due respect. So I want want you all to see. He was the advisor to Dashrath. He was a rishi, and he could speak in such a manner to Dashrath's son, Ram. Now, we have a similar example in the Mahabharata. And I wanted to cite this example also to you. So there's we've already talked about Charvak. Now this Charvaka, like I told you, so it can be one person, it can be people like him. He also comes in the Mahabharata, very briefly, in the Shanti Panth. When Yudhishthir enters the city of Hastinapur, a Brahmin referred to as Charvak accuses him of killing his own kinsman and says that he would suffer for it. He was killed by other Brahmins by the chanting of sacred hymns, and Yudhishthir was assured that his actions were within the Kshatriya code. This event may be a possible denigration of the Charvak philosophy. So what had happened was, when Yudhishthir comes back, he's come to Hastinapur after winning the great war of the Mahabharata. Now, we have been constantly told that Mahabharata was this holy war. It was eventually a war between cousins. With one cousin killing the other cousin, with members of the family killing each other, and the members of the family were the last set of people to die. Remember, when there is a war, who are the first set of people? It is the foot soldiers of both the armies. Now, was it their ladai? No. Did they have a problem with their uncles, aunts, brothers, cousins? No. But they were the people who died. After that will come your soldiers holding, the spears. They will die. Then will come your horsemen. They will die. The king and the emperor will come much later, seated on an elephant. They will be the last people to die. The point that I'm trying to make is that, it's been called the Holy War. It was a holy war for whom? Who benefited out of it? All these people who died, and there were so many people, there were so many foot soldiers who died. How were they cremated? It was impossible to cremate them. And Mahashata Devi has a very interesting story where she says that they were sort of rounded up, they were all put together, and a fire was lit. And this is when it was said that, if you fight in a holy war, you will go straight to heaven. Now, who knows if they went to heaven or where they went, because their families were bereaved and the bereavement continued. Nobody ever found out where they went or what happened to them. Now, the Pandavas themselves lost their own sons. All of them lost their sons. Not just Abhimanyu, there were 5 sons of the Pandavas who were also killed once, post the war, when, the revenge taking happens. Krishna knows about it already, so he manages to shelter the brothers, and he makes the sons sleep in that room, and the sons are killed off by Ashwatthama. Again, if you ask a father, many of you might be, and might be parents. So as parents, is the throne more important than your son? If you've lost your son, does the throne still seem that important to you? And yet it is supposed to be a dharma yuddha. So this person, this Charvak person, comes and accuses Yudhishthir straight to his face, and he says, what kind of a war did you win? Who did it benefit? So now the supporters of Yudhishthir, they could not allow the king to feel that he had done something wrong. So immediately they killed this man and assured Yudhishthir that no, you are Dharmaraj and this was a dharma yuddha which you have fought. Please sit on the throne and please be our emperor. The king was placated, but the question remained. And probably because, around this time is when the Charvak philosophy starts to disappear, because it had totally gone against the grain. And when people are assuming power, you do not want the contrary voice. The contrary voice is always put behind bars, as you will always see, even if you look at the current state of affairs. Okay. So then let me now come to the last part of the situation. Culture and sexuality. Now, these are questions, you all are young people. I want to pose these questions to you. Now, multicultural India has developed its discourse on sexuality differently based on its distinct regions with its own unique cultures. However, one common aspect remains: the existence of a subtle conspiracy of silence and taboos that clouds the Indian world of sexual desires and expressions. This, I think all of you will agree with me, that there are so many taboos, and then you're always told, हमारे घर के लड़के ऐसे नहीं करते, हमारी घर की लड़कियां ऐसे नहीं करते. And the fun phrase which is used very often, no sex please, we are Indians. So what happened here? This is a land of Kama Sutra. How did we become like this? Is the question that I want all of you to answer. So the attitude and opinions Indian people hold about their sexuality today, one that is hegemonically heterosexual and must aimed at procreation after marriage. So the reason why you get married, this is a very broad sense in which I'm talking. Of course, this is completely open to debate. But pretty much in every religion, it is felt that procreation is the natural cause. Procreation is why a marriage takes place. So two people come together eventually to have a child, and that child is then that the society accepts that child as a legitimate person who belongs to the society, and then that child grows up and contributes to the society. Now, India has had an extremely rich erotic past. All of you are aware of it. A myriad of folk tales, sculptures like those in Khajuraho and Konark, religious poetry, scholarly documents reveal homoerotic content and how love and sex between women, men, gods, demigods, and goddesses were expressed. This is something that I'm sure all of you know of. If you visited Khajuraho, if you visited the Konark, you are aware of, the sexually liberating things that you get to see there. And then the big question happens, then how did we become like what we have become? Why have we started to behave so differently? Now, the seeming contradictions, and here I'm hazarding a guess, of Indian attitudes towards sex, most broadly sexuality, can be best explained through the context of history. Now, India played a role in shaping understanding of sexuality, and it can be argued that one of the first pieces of literature that treated karma as a science came from the Indian subcontinent. I think all of you know it, all of you are aware of the Kama Sutra. It's one of the sutras that exist. And if you read the Kama Sutra, and I would very much want you people to, you will I've of course seen only the English translation, but what really intrigued me about the Kama Sutra was the use of a term which we think is a very modern term, the use of the term of partner. Normally we have only now started using the word partner. It was always husband and wife. But in the Kama Sutra, the word partner has been used throughout. It does not differentiate who your partner might be. And all the time we are told that the reason for this sutra, why was it written down, is to pleasure your partner. There is no talk about marriage. It doesn't tell us that you pleasure your marital partner. It tells us that you pleasure your partner. He or she may be anybody. It may be same-sex love. It may be heterosexual love. It can be anything. So imagine that this was written in India as a sutra, which was read and celebrated. And then things changed entirely. Then we started to behave in this very contradictory and strange fashions. It was somewhere between the 1st and the 6th century that the Kama Sutra, originally known as Vatsyayana Kama Sutram, Aphorisms of Love, was written. This philosophical work on Kama Shastra, it's Kama Shastra, so it's also part of your Shastras, or science of love, was intended as both an exploration of human desire, including infidelity, and a technical guide to pleasing a sexual partner within and outside a marriage. Now mark the dates, gentlemen and ladies, 1st and 6th century. And here we are in the 21st century saying, let me not say what we are saying. It's known to each one of us. Okay, I just picked up a random picture to show you the Kama Sutra. All of you understand it. Those of you who have visited Khajuraho, you've seen it for yourself. Okay. So it's also during the 10th and the 12th century that some of India's most famous ancient works of art were produced, often freely depicting romantic themes and situations. Examples of this include the depictions of the Apsara. So you've always seen the Apsara in a very romantic and a very sexual mode, the way she stands and the way she, so she's the nymph or the siren in the European or Arabic mythology on some ancient temples. The best and the most famous examples can be seen in Khajuraho. This was built in the 9th to the 12th century. Another picture, this is of the Apsaras that I wanted to share. So you look at how, they're buxom ladies, their slim waists, the way they are standing, they're goddesses, very beautiful. And what are the performances of these goddesses? They're there for allurement, the Apsaras. Okay. Now, this is something which I feel affected us very directly, the colonial onslaught. Now, I'm coming back to something that you all know about, and I'm talking about the British colonial onslaught of India, which lasted for almost 200 years. And as we all understand that we love to copy our masters, we learn from our masters. So they were our masters for the longest period ever. So what do we see? I'm now talking about the Victorian period. The Victorian period was an extremely repressive time. Women were perceived simply as a man's helpmeet. So she did not have any rights or privileges per se of her own, but she was there to help the man. Education of the woman was only for helping her male counterpart. So she was taught to be the perfect lady, or she was taught to help her husband, not for educating herself. The whole concept of covering of the body, and most importantly, what we students of English literature study to a great extent, the validation of virginity. Remember, Queen Elizabeth was the virgin queen, and virginity was supposed to be, the highest form of existence, so to say. And sexuality was linked to licentiousness in the patriarchal worldview. And my guess is that a lot of what we learned about hiding our bodies by behaving as women who would be dependent on men, the higher strata of the society where women were not supposed to work. See, one strata of society, women have always worked. When you look at your construction sites and you see the women, with the child tied on her back, and she's climbing the ladder and she's working side by side with men, that kind of woman has existed right from the beginning of when our society started till today. That woman has not gone away. But the higher class woman, because we started copying what the colonial masters were teaching us, started to dress like that. I'm sure all of you are aware that there was no concept of a blouse. Now the blouse was blouse and a petticoat. Even the name tells you it's a petticoat. Comes from comes from the British. So women covering their bodies, covering their wearing petticoats, wearing blouses. I'm sure all of you also know about the way that women were by then completely sort of segregated, put in their place. So there's a whole gender suppression story that is very, very prevalent around that time, which continued. So about women not getting education, belief systems such as if a woman looks at a book, her husband will die. Women are not supposed to be educated. Women are supposed to burn fires lit for their if the husband passes away. There's so many, and we have seen so many. But I personally feel that these were some of the things that we were aping from our colonial masters, which is why we started dressing in a certain manner. Now look at the way the ladies would dress. Now what she's wearing is a girdle and a skirt. You see how tough that is. She had to wear that girdle inside of her skirt and had to carry that throughout the day. And her bodice was tied so tightly so as to make her waist look very, very slim. So a lot of things that we were learning from these. So then the conservative views of sexuality are now the norm in the modern Republic of India and South Asia in general. Women are perceived as the upholders of tradition and culture, which is used as a stick to impose the patriarchal norms. So patriarchy functions by the girls being told, "Tum hamari ghar ki izzat ho, तुम्हें हमारे घर की इज्जत हमने सौंप रखा है." How come it is always the girl, child, or the woman of the house who's supposed to be the upholder of this izzat? So that's how the patriarchy functions. Women are, however, revered in matriarchal forms as the Devi or the mother in a household. Now, this is very interesting. A woman gets some, position of power when she becomes a mother. And the mother is also worshipped in our culture. So you have the Devi culture, which all of us kind of understand. Whether it's goddess Durga, whether it's goddess Saraswati, whether it's all the, we have, 33 crores of gods and goddesses, we are told. So the Devi Pujan happens. And then in the same breath, in a reverse sexism, as I call it, the domination happens in the households. That is how patriarchy is working. And I end now, this is the last quote, I end with an African woman author, because this is another area of my interest, but I feel that she's speaking for me. She says, culture does not make people, people make culture. Mark the words, culture does not make people, it's people who make their culture. If it is true that the full humanity of women is not our culture, then we can and must make it our culture. So as long as women are not given equal rights to exist, then we have failed culturally. So we can go to town beating our cultural tom-toms and saying, oh, we have the richest culture. But within that culture situation, if we are keeping the women of our country suppressed, then we have definitely failed ourselves. And this is a picture that you all know, which we were talking about. I did not even go there because I thought you all know about it, the diversity that is India. So anybody who dares to tell you that India it has this uniform kind of a thing which needs to be followed, they are completely wrong. India is completely diverse in terms of its food, in terms of its dress, in terms of its religious practices. There is no which is better and which is worse. Each of them coexist, and that is the beauty of India. And I'll quote Tagore here. I don't have the quote here, but I'll quote him from memory. Tagore, during his world tours, used to talk a great deal about nationalism, and he used to always talk about what is India's role in the world. And he said that India's role is to show the world, particularly Europe, because Europe is, India is like a mini Europe with different cultures, different languages, and so on. So he says, the job of India is not to go and conquer, but the job of India is to show the world how multiple cultures, multiple religions, multiple belief systems, multiple societal systems can coexist all in the same place, take pride in a few national symbols, but overall feel proud to exist within the same space and where the culture of debate continues. All of you are familiar with where the mind is without fear and the head is held high. And he talks about, education being given to everybody. I end here now. I've thrown open a lot of areas for you all to think about and to ask me questions. I would now request.
Thank you so much, ma'am, for putting things into perspective for us. Indeed, it was an engaging and enriching session for all of us. And ma'am, the way you explained the topic, the little things you covered was extraordinary. I personally like your idea of understanding the importance of debate. That's where the beauty of our culture lies. So yeah, thank you so much, ma'am. And now we are open for Q&A session. So those who may want to ask anything can unmute their mic and ask. And yes, may also leave a question in the chat box.
Will you read the questions from the chat box?
Sure, ma'am, we'll do that.
Ma'am, am I audible?
Indeed you are.
Yes, sir, you're audible. Please ask the question.
Ma'am, I have a question. I'm Professor Namandeep Singh from Vishnu School of Management. The question is why some cultures and personalities are not still acceptable in some countries. Like we are Sikh, some countries do not accept our culture, our personality. At the airports, they stop us, they do extra checking. Our kirpans are not allowed in international flights. Why this? There is a sort of culture, and they are not accepting this culture.
I can completely empathize, and you are absolutely right. And it is absolutely, it is unequivocally, I will say that it is wrong. So if they are not accepting of you, they are committing a crime against humanity. It is not right. I can understand the country's desire to keep itself safe. That is one part of the story. But refusing to engage with and understand why a certain religion behaves in a certain manner, if you are going to be that myopic, then how can you ever progress? So that bit is absolutely and completely wrong and reprehensible, according to me. But Ramandeep, I'm calling you by your name. You look very young. It's not just against a religion. Currently, post 9/11, you would have seen it happening to each one of us who are traveling, double, triple checks of our laptops, special checkings that are going to happen. So some countries, unfortunately, because of the color of our skin, because of the religions that we have, we are targeted. And then my question, I can be very critical of other countries. But when we do things like that, when within our cultural and social systems, we are discriminating between one person and another, is when I feel particularly hurt. Because this is my country. I don't want things like this happening here. I can be very critical of US or somebody else and say that they are making a mistake. But when we do similar things is when we have to be very, very careful that such things do not happen. But yeah, to answer your question, absolutely wrong. Absolutely, absolutely wrong.
Thank you, ma'am. Thank you so much. Thank you.
May I answer his question? May I answer his question?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Thank you. You can answer, sir.
Since I belong to that community, I was going to Northeast and carrying a small blade, 7 o'clock, because the snake bite is very prominent there. To take out the poison, the blade is required. But I checked at the airport at Ahmedabad, I was not allowed. So nothing to the religion. This belongs to my safety. It was not allowed. It is not allowed because of technical reasons. It is not allowed. But it is allowed during the war. Recently in Galwan, same soldier who belonged to this community, he killed 10 militants because he is allowed. Over and above his weapon, the second weapon is also allowed, which is a personal weapon. So this is where it is useful, it is allowed. Where it is not useful or technically it is not allowed, will not be allowed. So
yeah,
nothing to do with the religion.
Which is what I was talking about, the security factor. Every country has business taking care of its security. That has to be paramount given how the situations are. But having said that, if any disrespect is being shown towards the religion, that needs to be totally called out. Next question, please.
Madam, I got a question. Firstly, the beautiful topic they have chosen it, and I think they have chosen the right person also, meeting you for the second time in the last 2 years.
I'm sorry, sir, I'm not able to hear you very well. I can hear 2 sentences, then the next 2 sentences I can't hear.
Yeah.
Come closer to your mic, maybe.
No, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yeah. Best topic and best speaker. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Now, firstly, when you talk about the culture, India is a universe, is a word. If you want to have a Sahara Desert, it is there in Rajasthan. If you want to go to Norway, Sweden, Finland, it is there in Uttarakhand and Himachal Pradesh or J&K. You want to Amazon River, there Ganga basins are available. This is one part. And secondly, number of languages being spoken in India. And so number of religions are there, that the maximum religion being followed in India only, no other country. So back to the point of my question. This is the one country, this is the unity in diversity, which is slogan has been given only few years back. The best example of this culture. unique culture, diversified culture, still we are one. This is my point. Now the question for you is, the religion which came 2500 years back, Buddhism is fine. Buddhism is fine, but Jainism is a very old religion. Nobody can define when the Jainism came. Rather, Buddhism came is a bridge between Hinduism and Jainism. Hinduism was too cruel, Jainism was too calm. So it was in between the two religions have come. These are my views. Second, my point is Ram, regarding Ram, Maryada Purushottam. It was just the ideal person has been depicted. The ideal person, we worship him. My grandfather is the ideal, so I worship him. A similar way, Adi Shankaracharya, he was not a god, but he gave a philosophy of Hinduism that later on, Vivekananda did the same thing. Thank you very much. No more to add.
Thank you so much for your observations. Very well taken. And I would agree with you when you say that, I worship Ram because he is Maryada Purushottam to me. Absolutely. Anybody can worship anybody. I worship my grandfather because I really like him. Point valid. The problem happens when I say, how dare you not worship Maryada Purushottam Ram? Everybody should worship Maryada Purushottam Ram. I think if Ramchandra himself were here, a person who will sit with Jabali and who will discuss, he would have told you, you have the freedom to worship what you want or who you want. The idea is not to impose. The idea is to keep it open. Whoever wishes to worship, whoever. It is your call. It is your life. You can worship your teacher. Teacher who has shown you how to go about your life, or your father or your mother or anybody. But the day I say that I worship X and you also have to worship X, otherwise you're doing something wrong, that is where the problem is. And that is what, as a society and as a culture, we should be very, very careful against that. That's all my very limited point. Thank you. Next question, please.
Ma'am, there's a question in chat box.
Yeah.
From Manana's ma'am's side. She says, what are some uncanny virtual tropes in literature text that portray disability or specially abled?
What are some uncanny I can see the question, uncanny representation that show cultural diversity? No, I'm not able to understand you, Ananya. What are some uncanny virtual trope in literature texts that portray disability or specially able? Ananya, lots. I mean, depends on which literary texts we are talking about. So disability has been portrayed right through the ages. You have the sage Ashtavakra. Remember, he's supposed to be, twisted in a certain manner. That's why he was called Ashtavakra. And yet, he was one of the most brilliant sages who could argue the Vedas and talk about it to great lengths. So you have right through, your Vedic times to contemporary times, if I may add, you have Mahesh Dattani's Tara. So you have disability being shown constantly in literature. The only difference is earlier sometimes, not with Ashtavakra because he was who he was, but you did have a fear that the person is different. See, every person or every culture, they have a problem with somebody who's somewhat different. So that person who's different is sometimes shown in a negative light, which is absolutely wrong. That wrong has now started to be righted by people doing disability studies and by people engaging with these characters and saying that they were shown in this manner, but now there is an attempt to read them in their correct perspective. So, but yes, disabilities have been shown right from the very beginning, from when, writing started.
I don't see any more questions here, only words of appreciation. I again repeat, is there any questions from participant side? Okay, I think this brings us to the end of the presentation. And before we say adieu to all, I would like to request Dr. Bamnendra Naveen Narang, Managing Director, Vishesh School of Management, to please present the sum up message and vote of thanks. So please.
Am I audible?
Yes, sir.
Thank you so much, Nandini ma'am, for sparing your valuable time. It has been a very different session altogether. And yes, I do agree that, everybody has a different perspective, everybody has different belief systems, and one should always be open to debating on them rather than criticizing each other or not accepting each other. So I would just like to say that, somebody like Jabali coming and convincing Lord Ram about, whatever the decision he has made, he should probably think about reversing that decision. And if you look at his life altogether, he has been a man who has faced adversities, a lot of adversities. But something that he has never let, something जो उन्होंने कभी नहीं छोड़ा was his belief system. So whatever the belief system is, it might be, it can be any belief system. It can be your religion, it can be a way of life, but whatever it is the belief system, it should be in such a way that, nobody can sabotage or, convince you otherwise. Whatever your belief system is, if you believe that it is right, and if you think that it is leading your life in a certain way, in a certain direction, you should be grounded to that belief. If somebody can come and talk to you, okay, probably debate with a lot of conviction and try to convince you otherwise, that means you've not been firmly rooted to that belief system. So whatever it is the belief system, you should be firmly rooted, because that is what gives you a good, because a belief system is just like your roots. So a tree with the weaker roots is always vulnerable to harsh weather, and a tree with deeper roots is not that vulnerable to harsh weather. So, have a good belief system, and obviously, whatever the belief system is, it should be right. Be wise in choosing your belief system. Don't have something that is being imposed upon to you. That is what ma'am was always, that is what ma'am is saying today, that, don't have an imposed belief system. Have something that you choose by yourself. So I hope that everybody chooses the right belief system and follows it to the right end, and hopefully your belief system leads you to the right way. So it was a completely different lecture series, and I hope it was an enriching one. So thank you so much, ma'am, for your valuable time, and thank you all the participants for attending it. Over to you, Yashri.
Yeah, thank you so much, sir. And once again, I would like to thank Dr. Nandini ma'am, Director sir, and Naveen sir, and all the dear participants for joining us. Before we leave, I would like to present, we would like to present actually certificate, appreciation certificate to Dr. Nandini sir. Small token of gratitude from our side, ma'am.
Thank you. Really means a lot. I have this long-standing relationship with Vishesh School. You all have also given me this highest honor, Vishesh Shiksha Samman, for which I'm extremely grateful. So thank you so much for having me. Thank you so much for listening to me. And like I keep saying, keep your spirits alive and keep your debating capacities alive throughout your life. Nothing that you might know or not know is not open for debating. And if that is there with you, you'll go through life as a very aware person who is very deferential to the other person. And like I keep saying, you can always agree to disagree, but you need to do it respectfully. You need to do it with a lot of dignity, and you need to, and that will, and of course, when do you debate? When you have knowledge to be able to debate. So acquire the knowledge skills and have an open mind. That's what is most important. The day we decide that we know everything and what I know and my situation is the best is like, that's a death knell to all of us, all of our thinking minds. So keep the mind agile, keep the mind thinking, learn new things every day. And I think And let me wish you all the very best, all of you young, smiling people. Stay safe, stay good, till we meet next time. Thank you, Dr. Iqbal. Thank you, Dr. Narang and other dignitaries here. It's been wonderful being with all of you.
Thank you, ma'am. Thanks a lot to all the participants. There's one more announcement that we are going to organize next lecture on 8th of July on the emotional intelligence. We will forward the entire information on the WhatsApp group. Kindly join us.
Thank you so much, sir. Hope to see you all in the next coming session. Till then, keep learning, stay safe. Thank you.